Hello and welcome back to Restoration DIY. If this is your first visit, then it's great to have you here and I hope you all enjoy this video. In this episode I'll be making a bowl using offcuts of maple and ash cast into black epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. Rather than cutting the offcuts into smaller chunks, I use them as they were, placing the bigger pieces in the casting bucket first and then arranging the smaller pieces on top. Again, the only rule here is to keep the size of the voids as small as possible to cut down on the amount of resin I would need to use. So with the offcuts arranged in the bucket, it was time to mix the resin. Black was the colour of choice for this project, to contrast with a lighter coloured wood. I mixed 3 batches, though I'll only show one being mixed. The colourant I used was black alcohol dye combined with black pearl mica powder. I'm using my usual epoxy resin at a 2:1 ratio. Mix thoroughly for 4 minutes. The only change this time was I chose to add the colourant at the beginning. I did this for all 3 batches. All 3 batches mixed, I poured them into the casting bucket. Nothing difficult here, I just had to add some weight to stop the wood from floating in the resin. A plastic tub with 2 kilograms of weight held everything in place. Next, I placed the casting in the pressure pot, screwed the lid down and added 50 to 55 psi and left it to cure. It's a few days later and the blank has cured, leaving quite a lot of exposed offcuts. I had to remove a few of them with a hammer and chisel to get down to a level surface. This was much easier than I had first thought. The offcuts came away with a few well placed hits, and with that done, I marked the centre, drilled an 8mm hole and mounted it on the lathe with a woodworm screw, also using the tailstock to secure it in place. Let the turning begin. Starting with the Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher, I turn the blank down to round. The lathe speed is around 800 RPM until I get it better balanced. Then I turn it up to around 1100 RPM. The resin had been curing for about 3 days before I got it back on the lathe, and I could tell as this was one of the hardest blanks I've ever worked on. The carbide cutter was doing a good job, but it was getting very hot, so I just had to take my time to remove material down to the timber offcuts. The first time I stopped the lathe to check my progress, I noticed the grain in the offcuts was tearing out quite badly. This was because of the orientation of the grain in the blank. It's something I hadn't considered, and I will be more mindful of that in future resin castings. For now though, I just kept going, exposing more of the wood. I decided to switch to the 3/8 bowl gouge to see if that would cut any better in the harder resin, but this was not a success, and after having the back of my left hand painfully blasted with showers of resin shards, I went back to the carbide cutters. Early on I knew this would be a pedestal bowl, and with that in mind I set to forming the foot and the cutout. For this I used the carbide cutter. I began removing material, slowly working my way into the base. There was a lot of wood in this section, so progress was fairly straightforward, and it soon started to take shape. The carbide cutters were doing a good job, but I wanted to try something different, so I broke out the spindle detailing gouge, and despite an initial catch which left a fairly deep scar, I was able to cut deeper into the cutout section, and I was soon able to cut through the damaged part. With the cutout more or less to shape, I went back to the carbide to fine tune the surface. Then I used a skew chisel to blend and fare the curves into the side. The skew chisel did a great job of removing the tear out, and what was left would be removed by the lower grit sandpaper. So with that done, I moved on to flattening the base and forming the mortise. After flattening the base, I defined the edge of the mortise with a thin parting tool. I was aiming for around 80mm diameter to suit the jaws on my chuck. Then I used the gouge to remove the inner material and a dovetail cutter to cut the dovetail, and after a final tidy up with a gouge, I sanded from 80 to 3000 grit. After sanding, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, then I applied a single coat of sanding sealer to just the base section, denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad, then Yorkshire grit, again just applied to the base. Then I finished that part with wood wax 22. I will apply my full finishing process to the rest of the bowl after the inside is hollowed out. Once the workpiece was turned around and safely fixed in the 4-jaw chuck, using the tailstock for added support, I could begin hollowing out the inside. First off, I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to gently nibble away at the top of the protruding offcuts, working my way down to a level surface. I continued using the bowl gouge to start hollowing out, trying to take light cuts to try and avoid any catches, but the resin was just too hard, and it didn't take long before I had to switch to the carbide cutters. When I stopped the lathe to check my progress, I spotted a problem. Part of one of the offcuts had broken away from the rim, leaving a fairly big gap, but luckily I found the missing piece under the lathe, and with a good application of black star bond and an activator, I was able to effect a repair. Then I cut the waste away with a pull saw, and normal play could continue. A little bit more star bond to fill a small gap, and I used the carbide cutter to blend the repair back into the rim. Then I went back to hollowing out, leaving the centre support in place until I was confident that most of the weight had been removed. Switching between the full-size and mid-size carbide cutters, I was soon down to the bottom of the bowl, and I think it's worth pointing out that the position of the offcuts in the casting means that I was actually cutting down into the end grain, which would have contributed to the rough time I had with a gouge. Yet more star bond, this time to repair a few chips in the rim, and whilst I was at it, I filled a deep gouge from an earlier catch. All done and secured to the lathe, I removed the piece in the middle. The centre wasn't spinning fast enough for the carbide to be effective, so I risked the bowl gouge, which worked fine. Centrepiece removed, the rest was nice and easy. Using the carbide cutter to remove the high spots and fine tune the inner surface, ready for a final going over with a large negative rake scraper. Final check to feel for any inconsistencies, which are dealt with using the scraper, and it was time for sanding from 80 to 3000 grit. Sanding done, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, followed by a good application of sanding sealer, which I denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit, a single application, cleaned away until no more residue picks up on the paper towel. Time to polish the resin. First up, Mirka Polar Shine 10, a single application, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for Polar Shine 5. Another single application, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the last stage. And finally, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, polished off with clean paper towel to seal and protect the surface. And there we go, that's another project finished, and I hope you like this one. The black resin certainly stands out well against the light coloured maple and ash, and the orientation of the grain, for me, makes this one stand out even more. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. If I could ask you to give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.